Hi, welcome to Making Sense of Complexity, featuring conversations with complexity science practitioners and philosophers. Our goal is to share insights on how to make sense of our complex and uncertain world. Today our guest is Daniel Sanderson, a writer and blogger on science and philosophy, and the founder of Planksip, a philosophy and cultural media outlet for nonfiction authors and academics. Let's get started. Hey Daniel, how you doing?
Fantastic, George.
Yeah, it's nice to see you today. And I always start by asking my guests where they're calling in from and what's the weather like.
I'm sitting to my right here. I've got a beautiful window in my home office, and it's clearly the sun is shining. And I'm from and live on Vancouver Island, which is on the Pacific coast of British Columbia. So it's pretty good. Yeah.
Great. Yeah. I'm in Colorado at the moment, and it's kind of cold and a little bit breezy. The clouds are scudding by, but it's pretty nice. So no bad signs of climate change here today. So that's good. That's a good sign. So before we got started, I just wanted to say thank you for inspiring me in getting started on this podcast series and for agreeing to serve as an advisor. I really appreciate it. Thank you.
You're certainly welcome.
I want to start by having you give the audience a little bit of your background and how you got into philosophy.
Well, I would be what you call an amateur armchair philosopher. As I've moved out of the business arena, I've started my own media company and delved into philosophy quite heavily, as you're aware, and it's kind of dovetailed into a passion, and informs a lot of what I create, and in the direction that the overall media outlet has actually taken. So yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, let's talk a little bit about Planksip, because it's it's a great concept, and it's turning into quite an astounding collection of works, some that you've written, a few things that I've added, and some other people that you've collected together. So talk for a second about Planksip.
Well, Plank, if you break it into its two constituent parts, Plank is an organic platform, and Sip is kind of like drinking a hot cup of coffee. And so with those two visuals in mind, we wanted the platform to be an organic experience, and we wanted to challenge what consumption meant and what it could mean. So as a bibliophile myself, and just somebody that loves books, I want to encourage other people to consume in that way, as opposed to consumerism consumption. And I think when you put a platform in place where we can have meaningful human interactions, good things happen. So that's really kind of the nuts and the bolts of it.
Yeah, and it's as I said, it's got a lot of good stuff on it. So just in very general terms, how would you define philosophy? Philosophy is one of those words that makes people cringe a lot, and they get really nervous about, whoa, where are we going? But it doesn't really have to be that way. And I think you have an attitude about philosophy that's helpful.
Yeah, I mean, there's some of the like truisms or the cliches that you've heard with philosophy, but they're absolutely true. So the love of wisdom, and of course, what does that mean? And it gets you to think about things like justice and ethics, even love, and complexity, right? So really, this idea of philosophy is something that, as Plato said, begins in wonder. And if you're wondering about things and you're trying to question things in a healthy way, philosophy can be your best friend. And if you treat it
just
like
trying
such,
to
it
trying
helps.
to. I mean, the title of this podcast is Making Sense of Complexity, and so the making sense part really is pointing to philosophy. It's what we all do to try and make sense of stuff, right?
Yeah, and I think that would be without trying to assert any kind of domain over the rest of the complexity sciences, which I know you're aware of, are quite impressive and on the cutting edge of knowledge, right? So philosophy doesn't try and like maintain any sort of dominion over these this growing category of science. But what it is a really important constituent, I think, and really helpful, for people who are, wanting to think deeply and use, logic in their thinking patterns, right?
Yeah, and one of the ways people talk about philosophy as well is a search for truth. So what are your thoughts about, what that really means when somebody's about to search for truth?
Well, on a broad scale, I mean, we live in a very multicultural community, and by community, it's a very pluralistic. So we've got online communities, and we've got local communities, and we have all sorts of ways for people to network together. And by way of example, I think of one particular person that came and comes from an Eastern tradition of philosophy. And from their perspective, the West has, and I mean the tradition of Western philosophy, has a preoccupation with the concept of truth. That might dovetail into, a scientific emphasis or tradition, but doesn't have to, right? But it's just the metaphysical approach or the emphasis on truth in terms of living the good life, right? So that is something that when we understand that we're a collective of all sorts of people and cultures, that there's not a subjective interpretation to truth, but emphasis in terms of how it can lead to a productive, healthy life, right?
Yeah, I like the way you put that. It's leading to a better life. So it's something that can be used as a guide to a better life, a happier life, as opposed to defining it, with a capital T, like it's absolute. It's which all of us tend to do, and some traditions have more strongly than others.
Yeah.
Yeah, and you've used the phrase, I think, truth, and then as backed up by evidence. So there's got to be something telling you that this is something worth paying attention to.
Yeah. Well, I think when we first started, you said sometimes when you introduce the philosopher to the party, people will kind of groan and they think, oh man, because do we want to have a conversation of the nature of evidence and what constitutes evidence? And it's real. Sometimes, like, this is kind of the bad rap that happens for philosophers, and I think sometimes philosophers maybe spend too much time on that. I think that we can convey intention and meaning in a very broad sense. So I understand where you're taking this, and I think that individuals have an ability to process information in a eusocial way that is for the benefit of relationships on something as simple as a friendship, which is massive, huge, or the interplay in societies with there's a term called eusociality, which is a really important term that really emphasizes what it means to be human. I could make that much of a claim about that.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, I want to get into that, but I want to back up a second to this concept about truth as, you can sort of visualize it, and I think some philosophers do, as, a statement of, fact based on evidence, uncontrovertible, this is the way it is. It's like, the capital T, it's like, nail it against the wall. And I think your concept is much more of, it's a process, it's an evolution. It's not that there's certainty in what is being determined in this exploration of philosophical concepts, but it's a really an evolutionary process, right? So it continues to grow.
Partially, right? I mean, if we really, really put me under the microscope and I had to answer, like yes, Your Honor, kind of thing, right? Like the official. But you're right. I think a good response would be that if you look at the history of science, there's still the holy grail of science is to be able to discover something universal, something that is valid today, just as valid in 10,000 years, right? And so, the relationship of the Pythagorean Theorem, right? This is one of these examples. Or even though Newtonian law has been upended and improved, the basis and the foundation of these things start to build on each other, right? And so that is the thread that we as a civilization can look to and say, we have something to build upon, right? And so those may finesse, but they don't completely upend themselves, if that makes sense, right? It's not a complete relativistic sort of bottom. It has patterns that are recognizable and really pull back to the ability, a human ability to project and form patterns in and through abstract thought. Does that make sense?
Yeah, you made a distinction, which is an important one, I think, about like mathematics, Pythagorean theorem, or the truths of mathematics, which are just obviously true by definition, the way mathematics works, as opposed to empirical science, which is based upon observation and evidence and testing and trying to find a way to explain what's actually going on there. And so those are two very different kinds of activities. And we'd like to have clear and firm answers, but and we have that maybe in mathematics according to the definitions, but it's not something we really get in physical science.
Well, they say that mathematics is God's language, and I like that illusion, right? I like that. I like that idea of being God speak, mathematics. I think there's a beauty there that's.
Yeah, and I think I know I've told you I once upon a time believed that mathematics and logic was the pathway to true and absolute knowledge, and it was a great way to go. And then I later learned that there are problems in even mathematics and logic, things that are undecidable, things that are going to be incomplete. You can't ever complete the puzzle. That's even in math and logic, it's not necessarily as absolute as we might like.
Yeah.
I wanted to pick on the word you used a little while ago, eusociality, and just ask you for just a simple definition of that word and what it means.
It's not okay. So the definition of eusocial is a species working together, right? And so as a human species, we part of what it means to be human by definition is the fact that we work together and we cooperate. E.O. Wilson is a really good example of somebody that's championed frameworks around eusocial behavior.
It's interesting, and he started, and many do, with studying ants, which are a lot simpler than humans. But
and the ants are very deterministic, very structured, hierarchical automatons, and there's something quite different in what it means to be human. So the particular brand of eusociality, as it mixes and merges with the individual nature and ability for individuals to project ourselves into the world is quite beautiful. It's the self-awareness is quite spectacular and amazing, I think.
Yeah, and I think what's interesting is this is a piece of complexity science. Eusociality beginning with, the study of the simple insects and ants and how they behave, particularly the bees, and how they may not be conscious or reflective in the way humans are, but they working together in the patterns that they have, they do pretty spectacular things, building colonies, diversification of labor, very, very specialized kinds of things, and communication, even the way bees communicate with each other very, very specifically about direction and where to find food and stuff like that from simple beginnings. So I think this is the complexity science piece of it, where the activity of the individual units can't seem to explain the very intelligent behavior of the system as a whole. This is one of E.O. Wilson's big points, and then following up on what you were saying, when you look at humans, very, very sophisticated individual units, but we're built to be social. What other people think makes a difference to us, and so those relationships become a key part of what ends up building those relationships into a larger whole, which is the society that we know. So it's very, very important concept. And so your concept of eusociality, how does that fit into your personal philosophy?
I would say that it's not so much that it's part of a personal philosophy. I think it's a nod to the greater claim and the need that we have for a better integration of biodiversity. Integration, that's an incorrect word, but the idea is that biodiversity is very important. We are not in any way separate or distinct from the environment that we've emerged from. And so the wisdom that seems very, very apparent to me is that the study of eusociality, not only amongst humans, is it's also how we interact with our larger environments and other species as well, right? And I think that interplay and that huge complex system is what really marvels and really puts me into a state of wonder. And I think we owe ourselves the attention that it deserves to spend the time to think about what it means to live on a planet with that kind of healthy environment. I think that's really where I would go with eusociality for sure. Yeah.
And I think we mentioned earlier E.O. Wilson as a wonderful mind and a great scientist. Started with the idea, with looking at ants and entomology and building up these concepts of social behaviors. You and I spent some time on that subject last year. Would you take a moment and just talk about the work that we did and the podcast that we put out?
Oh my, George, my friend, we're going to summarize our whole season of podcasts into a sentence. But you know what? It was a great friendship. Hey, why don't we start with that, right? And we had a convergence of sorts in and around an idea called consilience, which was a term that E.O. Wilson used in one of his books, but was brought to us by the same man that came up with the idea for science, the word science, not science itself. But this is William Whewell, or Ewell. I'm not sure on the pronunciation, but It's the idea of it is a coming together, a jumping together, and I think one of the things that I've noticed in healthy dialogue in around this idea of consilience is that the intention is to try and bring together, and there are a lot of naysayers to that type of project in terms of let's keep them distinct and separate. The best example would be in a university setting, the arts and then the sciences, and where E.O. Wilson seems to be very courageous is to say, let's see how we can bring those two worlds together.
And he started
Yeah.
he started by talking about even the silos between the scientific realms in the universities. You have your physics and chemistry and biology, and they're kind of separate domains, and there's not a lot of interaction between those domains, in part because of the method of reductionism by which you find out more by diving deeper. So it becomes more specialized, and the language and the jargon is different. So now and he was a fan of trying to bring together the sciences, physics and chemistry and biology, and then by extension from those learnings, moving on into how does this explain, again, through sociality, social behaviors, and art and history and all those other aspects of the human endeavor. So we spent, I think it was 10 or 11 hours episodes on looking his book, Consilience, and we also added in the complication of consciousness, which is certainly a difficult topic.
Yeah, let's just pick some really, really challenging ones, right? Yeah. That was fun.
Yeah, and there's a parallel to my mind about complexity science itself, because it's kind of a smorgasbord of techniques and areas of inquiry. Some in the physical sciences, some in the biological sciences. You mentioned biodiversity as one, and then the social sciences. What arises out of sociality. And then the techniques that have been kind of developed to try and understand that. Complexity science is finding there's threads across all those disciplines. So in a way, complexity science itself is an attempt at that consilience that E.O. Wilson was so committed to. So that podcast series that you and I did, which is available on YouTube, on the Consciousness and Consilience podcast, was kind of a predecessor to what we're trying to do now with taking a deeper look at complexity science and how we can make sense of it all. So I think that's a good segue. I wanted to move into kind of the question, again, from your philosophical background, what is important to the project of making sense of things, making sense of the world and making sense of life. And, there are some terms in the philosophical literature that would be helpful to be able to talk about. Some of the listeners may be quite familiar with this, others less so. So I just wanted to ask you to kind of run down those areas that philosophers would typically say, well, you kind of need to think about this if you're really going to make sense of things. So do you want to start down that road and just see if we can begin enumerating what's important to making sense?
Well, I think epistemology is a great place to start, and what constitutes knowledge, right? This is a really important conversation to have. Justice, love, these are really important.
Before you move on, I want to take some time to dig into epistemology.
Oh, okay, all right.
That's okay. Epistemology. Okay, that's a fancy term for how do we know stuff, right? How is it that we know stuff? So, that's not a simple topic.
Yeah, and one of the things that the tradition of philosophy has done is that it's given us, I would say, arguably a progressive framework to see how knowledge has actually been described by various societies, and what it actually means, what knowledge it actually means in terms of its value in society, right? So what true knowledge is. Now, Aristotle, for example, he and Plato, which are quintessentially the birth of the Western tradition, I think. Okay, along with Socrates, and then the Hellenizing of the West through the conquest of Alexander the Great. This brought a disrupting, settling, I would say, benefit to the emergence of an awareness of a society, and it's very closely coupled to what knowledge is, right? Because there's an aspect to knowledge that I've been thinking about lately that could disappear, right? So civilizations in the past, due to something that may be no fault of their own, or in the instance of, say, a conversation about climate, it is something that is brought on by our activity. The shame would be that if large swaths of knowledge would disappear. And so even if we define knowledge, there's the threat that it might not be with us into the future. And that's something I've been thinking about quite a bit.
Yeah. It's interesting if you look back at the human species and what we've done. There was a period of time when all knowledge was oral knowledge that was passed on from one individual to another. And that clearly limits the ability to, we do have a lot of brain storage, and if you look at the oral traditions, they're an amazing, even in the early Greek period, I think there was a dissatisfaction. Was it Plato that was unhappy about the written word because it made people lazy? They didn't have to memorize things. They didn't have to know things exactly orally in the way that was traditional. And then we move into a period of time where we have written language, and then ultimately the Gutenberg Press, and then codified originally in papyrus by the Egyptians. So knowledge could be accumulated in a different form, and we now live in a world where access to any knowledge, or what people claim as knowledge, is just a couple of clicks away. So if people thinking about what about that knowledge, that how could we lose knowledge today given that we live in this kind of an environment? But you only know what you're paying attention to, right?
Oh, I have something that's kind of inspirational. I'd like to share it with you. And there's 2 points that I want to talk about. One is one of my favorite thinkers, who passed away in the last couple of years, in addition to E.O. Wilson, who's one of my favorites. But there's a literary critic by the name of George Steiner, he advocated quite heavily for memorizing. Okay, so he was a Jewish academic who still had family memories of the atrocities and the horrific nature that emerged out of Nazi Germany, right? And basically, everything could be taken from you, right? Everything, every worldly possession could be taken from you, but if you can memorize knowledge, and in that same mechanism of social spreadability or transmission, that can still be spread. No, that can't be taken from you. And that pulls back to, I think, what you're referring to in the emergence of I guess the transmissibility of what am I going to say, literature, but like knowledge and this type of thing. It emerged from like the poets, the bards of the Homeric epics and the stories of Gilgamesh. These types of things, these oral traditions, were passed down, as we know, through social groups. And then it's really interesting to study what part of the information transfers. What transfers when you have like transposition errors or multiple authors? What is the thread that pulls through, right? What is it that we as a eusocial species can galvanize around and then use as a valuable thread to reflect not only on our own human nature, but also give us some sort of tools to project into the future. And I think that's sometimes lost a little bit in our current condition of exploring complexity. Complexity, I personally would like to see a little bit more poetics in complexity. And that sounds a little bit odd, but there's a famous concept from Shelley, the poet, who said that the poets are the legislators of society. And so that's really interesting to me. And there's a bit of a contradiction, because I think anybody that knows and follows Plato would say, he's against the poets. I'd like to leave that aside, because it's not really relevant unless we really opened up the conversation. But this idea of imagination, this idea of where does the beginning of the ideas come from, I feel it really comes from a poetic, a sense of the muse, a sense of wonder. This is the beginning of something that this is where it emerges from, I think. And
yeah, so in a way, this is a very broad conversation about knowledge, and this points out that there may be, knowledge may be in the form of facts, which theoretically you can write down and pass on, and that's empirical sciences are built on that concept. But then you also have values or value, and then you have meaning from those values. A meaning in the sense of your how you define yourself, your ethics, how you behave, what do you need to do to be better and to improve. So this is an example. Epistemology is not just a simple, what are the facts? It's a lot more complicated than that. And I think that's a good example of a philosophical kind of inquiry, where you're not, you don't just write an answer down and think that that's it, but you really need to inquire and ask. So I think that was a good epistemological exploration, but it does seem that we are accumulating knowledge, right? We're accumulating scientific knowledge. Some of that knowledge, I know different people have different opinions about how much knowledge we have and how much we can gain. So again, this is a question about epistemology. There's another concept in philosophy that comes up a lot, and that's ontology. You want to take a second and take a crack at ontology?
Yeah, ontology is just the simple word is being, and you can take a look at the thicket of Martin Heidegger's work, where he takes the concept of being as moving into, being thrown into a being or ontology. Or you could take something a little bit more literary, like Shakespeare, to be or not to be, what and the questions that emerge from that literary genius. The idea of ontology is something that I have have been thinking a lot about recently. And the reason is that from a computer science standpoint, ontology means something very specific. We look at we look at ontologies in a computer system or in a mathematical system as something that we can fully and completely replicate. So once you have that and you replicate it in another system, that's the ontological framework for the computer system. And I think that's really interesting. So it starts to open up the idea that there can be multiple forms of ontology, multiple imagined forms of ontology, multiple verifiable and valid forms of ontology that can make sense, to us. And that's really interesting to me.
Yeah, it is interesting. And I go back to sort of the classic view of the world from the physical world being what's there, the ontology of a physical world as what is being, what exists, and that can be looked at in lots of different ways. And I think the traditional way is, okay, there are particles, the physics, particles, forces, gravitation, all of these things affecting everything. And there are people that believe that that is the only ontology and everything else builds from that. That was kind of an argument in E.O. Wilson. So that ontological framework, looks one way. But when you start looking at complexity science, the idea of particles and forces just doesn't play the same way, because now you have component units that build a system, and the system is very different from the sum of the parts. Mm-hmm. So now we get into maybe a different kind of way of thinking about ontology, because there are these emergent phenomenon that happen, different kinds of behaviors. It's very much more complex, and there are relationships between the what appear to be objects, and maybe there's a relation. Maybe ontology is really a set of relationships, not the thing that we think of. I mean, we think of a chair as a chair. It's an object. And you can build philosophies around, those kinds of ways of thinking about objects and categories and qualities. And but if you start thinking about the chair as a relationship, something you sit in, it's a whole different prospect, because it's relational. So again, ontology is a simple word, but in the philosophical exploration, it becomes really quite complex, quite challenging, and it requires an exploration process. Anything else you want to add?
That's a good summary, George.
Ontology?
That's interesting. If I may, could I ask you a question?
Sure. Because you're used to that.
Yeah, we've started to have we've defined, discussed knowledge and ontology. How would you think that aesthetics, because this is another really important thing, so a sense of beauty, how would you think do you think that beauty ties into both existence and knowledge? Do you think there's a component to beauty that brings those two together?
Yeah, that's a good example of a philosophical question. And I remember there's a book by the physicist Frank Wilczek about I can't remember the title, but it's really something about beauty, the beauty of the world. And he's a physicist, and he kind of takes it from a physicist standpoint, and the beauty of the mathematics, and the elegance of the mathematics, and the beauty of the structures that are that are evidence in creation. And it's a little hard to tell. He might actually still be a determinist, but he's seeing beauty in something which other people would think is just a bunch of abstractions. Mm-hmm. For other people, beauty and aesthetics is something that's deeply felt, personal thing. It's a relational thing. You have a relationship with a work of art. It inspires things. causes feelings, causes memories to appear. So it's a relational thing. So in terms of the philosophical side, I don't have a clear opinion about where aesthetics comes or where it derives. And I think that's, part of what, going forward, we have to talk about things like that a little bit more, the complexity of even something simple like, what's pretty, what's beautiful, how do you define it, what is it, why is it that way? In a way, it goes back in part to the eusociality argument. It's collective, there's a cultural set of inspirations that people have built through their history in a family, and that helps define what they feel is beautiful. And on the other, there's the physical construction of the eye, the evolutionary history of humans and the creatures that came before us, and that predisposed us to see certain things in certain ways. Well, it could also be a way of looking at aesthetics. So did I duck the question okay?
No, you did it really well. I think it's a very standard approach, but it's one that perplexes philosophers because there doesn't seem to be a baseline to agree on. And that was hopefully something I wanted to chat with you about, is the baseline from which it emerges. One thing that I've been working on recently is the starting point of beauty. And I'm making the claim that it's a biological substrate. We may not be aware of it, but this builds on the idea of a neuroscientist by the name of Antonio Damasio. And he talks about a concept called homeostasis. So you have something as simple as single cell organisms that will move away from a threat towards a state of homeostasis. And I think that this is the fundamental underlining constituent to consciousness, number one, but which Damasio makes the point on, but also I think beauty. And so what we categorize as beautiful, what we're aware of as beautiful, isn't doesn't have a necessary starting point, but it's all emerged from that cellular level to move towards a state of homeostasis. And I would say, to maybe sum up something for the listeners, the pleasure-pain principle is paramount to that concept, right? And it's noticeable in everything from plants to single-cell organisms to complex systems. And I think that's kind of where we need to look.
Yeah, I think E.O. Wilson talks a little bit about that as well in his work. Well, what about ethics? You've questioned where the baseline is upon which you make aesthetic choices and decisions, and the complexity there. Ethics is another key area of philosophical inquiry, trying to define what it is that is good, good choices, and what the ethical and moral considerations are. So, any thoughts about sort of ethics as it relates to the topic?
Yeah, I'm gonna come from a position of goodness, which is Plato. I think that the idea of goodness, and especially in and of itself, is something that is inherently ethical. Okay, we have a natural tendency towards good, and I think there's mathematical models that prove eusociality in that way. But there's also mathematical models that will show that we will punish for the sake of punishing, which is really perverse. But the overall is that the direction of humanity, I like to think, is a force for the good, if not to summarize it, the force for the good is even a strong desire to survive, right, and flourish. This is where I think the concept of ethics really derives from very fundamental as well, with the goodness, because it puts a hierarchy of virtues and value into a philosophical framework. And so we have a tendency to dismiss it, this idea of good, in terms of, well, this pen is good, or this is good, or this ice cream. We literally trivialize the whole, the value of having an ethical system built into into our philosophy and our way of life. And I think that Plato was very good at bringing that idea to light.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Again, ethics, key area of philosophy, very complicated. Lots of different ways of approaching it. It's not something that has a black and white answer, which I think is what the main point is. It's not like there's black and white answers. We have to realize there's an openness to it, and there's an inquiry that we have to do. And I wanted to follow up on a specific issue. My sense is that the science of the 17th, 18th, and 19th centuries had based on Newtonian physics and the concept of, everything has a reaction, equal and opposite reaction, and defined by mathematical laws, all the motions of the objects, created a sense that, geez, we've got these laws, we've got these objects, and if we could know the starting position of every one of these objects, and we have the mathematical laws, Newton's laws, you could figure out the future. Mm-hmm. And yeah. That was Laplace's demon, which was, I guess, 1814 when he came up with that, as the idea of this demon that had perfect knowledge of the initial conditions, and boom, it's all done, right?
Yeah, but
it's determined.
Yeah.
And so determinism is a thread in philosophical thinking among some, and yet it kind of leaves a pretty big hole about the concept of free will and the ability that we have to act and to make a difference in the world. So that's a specific philosophical dispute and issue, and just like to hear your take on that.
I wrote a book called The Free Will Debate. And basically, I find this conversation, and no fault to the questioning that you brought up, I find them very frustrating because a centralist position, which we could, for the sake of brevity of the conversation, just say that a centralist position really has one side saying exactly the same thing as the other side, and they actually really converge. And so there's although there is a discussion and a seeming dispute, I try and stay away from those kinds of arguments because we have agency, and if it turns out at the end of the day that we're automatons in a part of a larger scale unfolding of the universe, that is even like the butterfly effect, where it's not predictable and it's really unpredictable, a flux of nothingness, so to speak. The question could arise to say, well, should we, for our own sanity, just make something up and live by these rules? I tend to say, yeah. Right, let's call pretend, and let's call what we know reality, and if that challenges us, then it just keeps us asking questions, and I think that's really, really important.
Yeah, it's I'm reminded of the movie The Matrix, which obviously posited a sense, and it's that issue of there are a couple of funny issues in philosophy here about, zombies, which are, thinking beings that have no self-reflection, no consciousness. But you also have the same thing of the idea that we're in a simulation. It's not real. We're like a computer simulation. We're just inside of some giant machinery of digital ones and zeros and all that stuff. And so, it's kind of like you're saying, well, so what? Because we have these interactions, we have these experiences, we have these choices, it's as if we are living in a real, physical, embodied universe. So we might as well live that way. Whether it's a simulation or not is kind of irrelevant to the question of how we choose to live our lives. Is that a fair...
Yeah, and I'd get a lot of criticism for that kind of a response. It seems to be like giving up, or just kind of giving up on. But I don't think that's the case. I think the idea is that this description allows us to work together, to storytell, to build on lineage, which is one of the most important words right now in the idea of cultural evolution. So coming back to this jumping together of disciplines, the arts and sciences, and that word of lineage, when you couple that with culture, we're now talking about a pragmatic of sorts. Okay, how do we pragmatically transmit this information down through future generations? And I'll bring it back to the nature of knowledge. If the nature of knowledge is to say, here are the set of facts, that's very hard to codify in consciousness. It's very hard to have an experience with a fact. It's really hard to feel inspired by a fact. I'm not saying it's not possible, but in the words of somebody like... I won't bring up a quote because I know I'm going to butcher it. So what I will say is that we have the ability to make something new. And this is something that I really, really encourage people who want to explore and experience philosophy. You don't have to be an expert on every thinker from Plato on forward or Socrates on forward. You don't have to, and it's not about knowing what they said, or that's part of it, but it's also, well, what do you derive not only from your own experience, but as you plug into these philosophers, what experiences can you make new and how can you derive? Mm-hmm. Okay, so one of the reasons why we call a classic is because we can keep going back to it. Albert Einstein said it's called research for a reason. It means you do it again. You go back to it. You look at it again. And so if we go back, we research, we re-look at things, then you're going to find things like Albert Einstein did. You're going to find things like, maybe we can look at the shortest distance between 2 points and think of a different way. We can imagine it differently, and then we can try and reconcile that in the world. And just maybe you'll find something. And this is when you're speaking the language of the gods. Totally metaphorically, not to get anybody all upset at me, because it's, but this is absolutely beautiful to me. That's amazing.
So it's you can revisit the classics and learn things new every time you do.
Absolutely,
right?
yes, absolutely.
So I wanted to kind of make a transition and just ask about what is. So we've talked about science, we've talked about philosophy. And what is faith? And I wanted to start by just asking, did you grow up in a particular faith tradition? And maybe how has your view evolved as you've, grown and thought and explored philosophy and learned more about science and all that sort of stuff?
Yeah. Well, I'd like to open it with something that I think is pretty important. To me, a well-balanced society will take a look at the wisdom that comes from older generations and the emergence of new ideas that come from younger generations. So to kind of get our grounding here, there's a real understanding that a physicist's best work is in his early 20s. That's where you're the quickest in terms of your thinking, you're the most proficient in terms of output. It's like the golden time period for somebody who's in physics.
I've heard that mathematicians peak at 26.
Yeah, something like this, right? And ironically, or no, not ironically, very compatibly, the prefrontal cortex only fully develops at that age as well. I don't know if it's the same for both men and women, but I know that men, that's about 25. So what I think happens is that when we think we have a complete understanding of the world in say our young 20s, as we start to get older, we realize that maybe that's not quite right. Okay? And if that's not the case, I think there's a lot of hubris and assumptions built into that. I think that naturally there's things that change even on self-reflection. As you become an older person and you reflect on your youth, you're going to say, oh, if I knew now what I knew then, these kinds of things, right? So wouldn't it be ideal if we could tap into the wisdom of our elder generations in a way that maximized not only utility, but love and happiness and beauty and wisdom, to its full capability? Now, I think that number one is an ideology that's not possible simply because there are historical forces that are beyond a generation of birth and then death. There's types of unfoldings in history that may find us in a very warlike civilization, or a civilization where there's great austerity or great inequity, and those actually inform the derived meanings that we actually have. Now, this sounds like a really roundabout argument, or I guess like description of something, when all you asked me about was what my thoughts were on faith. And so here's how I would kind of bring it back together, is that the codifying of this larger encompassing type of knowledge is to me our best attempt is that word God. And we can never get completely in sync with her. I'll use that just to be a little pokey, right? But anyways, although I could make the claim as a matriarchal foundation to it as well, which is kind of fun. But anyways, I grew up as somebody that was in a relatively secular home with roots in, I would say, Christianity, but probably Unitarianism, and or the ethic of a Lutheran work ethic, these kinds of things. So it's like, we believe in God, but we don't really know why we believe in God, and it's kind of up to you if you want to go to church, and you kind of do it if you want to do it. So that's kind of how I was brought up. I think that's symptomatic of a culture that really doesn't have problems, or doesn't have great stresses, that has a lot of freedom to do what they want. When the other shoe drops, I think things tighten up, and I think people turn to more of a spiritual structure because they've been around for generations. And I think that we are living in a time period right now where that's exactly the case. If you were to ask me about, I want to give you two examples. When I knew it all as a young child, as a young teenager, I remember having a conversation with my grandmother, and I said, "Oh, it's silly, it's ridiculous. There's no such thing as God. If God exists, why?" Blah, all these kinds of things, right? And although it's not an earth-shattering response, it is kind of a felt earth-shattering response. And this is what the response that came from my grandmother was. She says, "Well, when I die, I would like to think that I will be able to see you and my family again." And so there's that smart-ass teenager looking at her going, what do I say to that? Right? What?
Yeah.
I mean,
Yeah.
And there's stories.
What do you feel about it?
Yeah, what do you feel?
About it?
I mean,
Yeah.
I'd love that to be true. And I read something on a social media post just today, and it had to do with euthanizing animals. And there's lots of animal lovers out there, including myself and George. I know you are as well. There's times, just because of our lifespans, is that we kind of live with animals in a way that we outlive them, and we have to suffer through their deaths. And if you're ever in a situation where you had to euthanize an animal, the point of this one particular social media post was that you should be present for that, because the stories from the veterinarians was that they describe this like searching for who they love. Like, it could be they want you there, right? They want those last seconds to be, they're searching, and they're saying, be with them,
Yeah.
And
Just a sidebar. When my kids were young, we had that experience. 2 dogs. One developed bone cancer, had to be put down, and it was right to make that a family event. The vet came out. We said goodbye. We had a little ritual, and we buried the animal together afterwards. And today, one of my sons is finishing his studies to be a veterinarian.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And imagine, okay, so now, George, this is why I love you, George. I could say this is why I love talking to George, but this is why I've got a real affection for George here, because now you'll get the concept that your son or daughter, your son is a veterinarian?
Son, yeah.
He has now everything that he needs to bring about real goodness in the world. Like real substantive goodness. And it could have been partially because of this, but because of many other things, right? And this seems to me to be a description of something that is a real good in the world. And if he has that ability to do that, we're actually talking about trans-species eusociality. We have dogs that are the closest to us in terms of species. That's why they call them man's best friend. And they communicate to us in ways that are beyond language. They have somewhat of a language apparatus, but they communicate to us in ways that it's just remarkable. It's just remarkable. You can observe how animals react to you, and they have real personalities. They display affection, and they're and so that's fascinating to me, and I applaud that. I applaud that value has been impregnated into your offspring. To be very,
and I think
that's
I think it is for
that's amazing.
I think it is. You had your grandmother do that for you. So we're gonna have to wrap it up,
Okay.
but I just want to tell you I really appreciate this kind of framework you have created for thinking about faith Again, not as black and white dogma, not as, firm committed to this, but as something that involves a complex trajectory of personal experience, cultural experience, the shape of what you grew up with and in, and how that affected you and how you responded to it. So again, this is part of a complex process that doesn't have a fixed answer. And that openness and being able to bring that openness with us into any inquiry is kind of a bottom line for being able to get to the best result, call it, at the end of the day. And I want to thank you for putting that on the table so eloquently. Thanks for appearing today and for your wonderful comments.
It's my absolute pleasure, George.
Thanks for joining us on this episode of Making Sense of Complexity. Next episode, I will be talking to Sam Barton, philosopher, host of the Talk of Today podcast, and the product lead for Idea Market, an online marketplace for ideas. Join us as we discuss the ethical implications of complexity science. In the meantime, please explore the websites of our collaborators, Complexity Weekend, Planksip, and Talk of Today, and join the conversation on our social media outlets or on spiralinquiry.org. Stay well and have a great week.